It's been great. I just did a session on inclusive growth, talking about it. Um, and the key takeaways for me, at least what I spoke about, was the importance of having not just education per se, but education that leads to employability, and also the importance of execution. Because Africa has got a huge amount of promise, but to take that promise and translate that into reality,
Right.
you need execution.
I mean, some people are talking about the so-called missing middle, not quite poor, but not quite affluent, and that this is where business needs to be focusing its efforts by way of recognizing them as a consumer class and by way of extending credit to spur some sort of entrepreneurship. What do you make of that kind of potential now that you're talking about the middle class, education, and the things that really concern growth and development of the populace?
I would violently agree with you on that score, because if you take any society, we were talking earlier about SMEs. SMEs actually generate more than 50 to 60% of employment in any economy. So the role of that middle is very important. Very often we talk about the large companies, or we tend to look at the bottom of the pyramid because that's become fashionable. But to me, it's the middle, it's the bulge which really matters.
All right, now obviously Standard Chartered, you're competing in what's become the frontier markets of Africa, the emerging economies of Africa. As people are looking for capital to finance business on the one hand and infrastructure, that's a real issue. What have you identified as concerns?
We look at it as a huge opportunity, actually. Standard Chartered has been here in Africa for almost 150 years. And what we are seeing, and we are playing a role, is intermediating the trade and investment flows into Africa. We are also helping African companies and governments raise capital, a recent example being the bond issue we did for Senegal. And equally, it's about capacity building. To the extent we have over 7,000 employees in Africa, but equally we deal with a lot more people in these economies, and it's about capacity building.
Right. Talking about that issue for Senegal, but not specifically that, the question is, as many countries start to launch these international sovereign bonds, the pricing of that risk, the timing of launching some of those bonds right now, when we're seeing the global recovery quite sluggish, we're seeing issues around sovereign debt coming to the fore in Southern Europe, competition with China and Asia. Where does Africa fit in the continuum?
Pretty well. Actually, emerging markets fit pretty well. There has been, I think, a fundamental change in risk perception of emerging markets. So what you're seeing is a lot of fixed income funds moving their money away from traditional markets, such as in Europe, into emerging markets, not just in Africa, but also in Asia. So you're seeing spreads, for instance, on Indonesian paper being lower than that of many European countries.
All right, now, for the investor coming into Africa today, what's the basic concern? We've spoken about infrastructure and we've done that ad nauseum, but what else?
I think they would be concerned. It'll vary from sector to sector.
Okay.
A lot will depend on, some of them would be concerned about the regulations, whether they are allowed to participate, and once you get here, will the rules stay in force or will they change? But if you were to just ask me about broader themes, it is not just infrastructure, it's also about agriculture, it's about resources, and it's about the broad African consumer story.
Talking about those credit flows, I mean, when things are looking up, we're seeing portfolio inflows into a major economy like South Africa. We know the figures for FDI have improved something like 87%, but how does Africa truly compare to Asia? Because it may be an improvement of 80%, but is it still significant figures compared to the kinds of monies going into Latin America, going into Asia?
It's probably, it's a fraction of what is going into some of those markets, but you need to make a start somewhere. So I think the real way to look at it is Africa, the flow of foreign direct investment into Africa today, how does that compare with what Asia received 10 or 15 years ago when they got on the process of reforms and attracting foreign direct investment?